I think there's more of a conversation about the impacts of climate change on military institutions in the coming years. I mean, I get sick of these people who are still trying to fight that is climate change happening. It's like, there has never been a single thing that there's been more evidence for in human history, I think. It's time to, really make the hard decisions about mitigation, about slowing and hopefully reversing this process at some point in our near future, because if we don't, this is an existential threat to human beings on this planet. And, if you're not willing to stand up and fight for the existence of human beings, I mean, what's the point of this whole thing of us 8 billion humans on the planet?
Welcome to Straight Talk, where we cut through the BS and get straight into real conversations with some of the best minds on the planet. I am your host, Af Malhotra. I am blessed to be leading these extraordinary discussions and asking tough questions that then elicit insightful answers, accelerating our awareness of the biggest issues impacting our lives and the future of humanity. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's Af Malhotra here at Straight Talk. Thank you again for joining our excellent show. Once again, today I have an incredible guest, an extraordinary guest actually, and someone who is going to open our eyes to the future of war. And it sounds like a depressing topic for many of you, and it's morose and scary, in fact, for those who are not in the military. However, it needs to be addressed and it needs to be discussed, so we accelerate our awareness. That's what Straight Talk is about. And we have a wonderful individual with us today, the retired Major General Mick Ryan. Mick, I'm going to call you Mick if that's okay. Welcome to...
That's very fine with me.
Yeah, welcome to the show. Thank you for giving us an opportunity to take an hour of your time. And I loved reading the summary of your book. I haven't yet actually finished the book, and it's
I've heard it's very good.
Yeah, yes, no, so have I, and I've been captivated by so much. Your big focus on how history teaches you that war is inevitable. I'm a believer of that. The whole area of what we call at Straight Talk East-West digital, but also the geopolitics of China, Iran, and the Western nations. You talk about how change needs to happen, how countries need to work in a cohesive way to look at the 21st century way of combating or warfare, virtual and physical. You talked about how the character of war has changed, the constant learning and failure that comes from war. And we talk a lot about you've interestingly launched your book a few weeks before. I don't think it was deliberate, but coincidental that it was a few weeks before the Russian-Ukraine situation.
It was 9 days before the Russians began their illegal invasion of Ukraine. Correct.
Right. Okay. And so super topical, and I'm sure you've had interview after interview discussing that, which we'll discuss today as well. You talk a lot about new technologies in warfare, which is very important to our community because we are obsessed with digital of all sorts, whether it's AI, machine learning, computer vision, hypersonic, cyber, and cyber terrorism and cyber warfare, which doesn't often get discussed in shows like podcasts and so on and so forth. And then you finally talk about the future. What does the future hold? The good stuff and also the scary stuff, mass migrations, climate change. And if things don't go to plan, if we're not able to deal with the aggression of certain nations, where could we end up? And I think that creates what we call a compelling sort of sense of urgency for people to take action, who are watching our show. So thank you again. I'd like to start by moving first to your personal story. Who is Major General Mick Ryan? I know you've retired just quite recently, and what's your personal story before we jump into the book, because that's so important for us.
Well, I was brought up in a little tiny mining town in my home state of Queensland. So I think there was about 1,000 people in the town when we first got there. I went through the public school system for my entire life. In fact, for the first 7 years of schooling, I don't think I even wore shoes. I wore shorts, a T-shirt and a hat. So it was that kind of upbringing. It was wonderful.
Right.
It was a kind of town where you didn't lock your front door and you never locked your cars. I joined the Army at 17. I got a scholarship to go to the Australian Defence Force Academy, become an Army officer, and also study civil engineering. I failed that. I failed my first year terribly. I think I still have the record for the most subjects in a year failed. But I was given a second chance by a general who was in charge, and I was determined that I would both make the most of that second chance, but also learn from that second chance that, failure is not all bad, and that second chances are very powerful, and we should give them to people wherever we can. Yeah. But I eventually graduated from the Royal Military College, become a combat engineer, and my career has essentially kind of gone between command of soldiers at the platoon, company, battalion, task force, brigade level, combined arms teams, operations in our region in the Middle East, and a whole lot of strategic postings here and in the United States, doing high-level strategy in military affairs as well as interagency joint operations. And that's me. And the start of this year, I retired from the Army after 35 years. I'll be quite frank, I retired very happy, very satisfied, adoring the institution that I retired from. But at 53, I was ready to do something different. I wanted to write, to speak, and contribute to my country in a different way.
Yeah. And was the military background in your family extended, or were you the first entrant into this world?
I had a grandfather who was in the Royal Australian Air Force in the Second World War. I had a great uncle who was in the Army in Papua New Guinea in the Second World War, but it wasn't a military tradition. I was kind of the first of the line, and I don't think my children are going to follow me in that line. But after 35 years, I've probably done the Ryan family bit for at least a generation. But it was a wonderful 35 years, and I wouldn't, frankly, change a thing. It was just amazing.
Incredible. And it's great to hear that, in any line of work, to come out of that work and move into a different phase of your life and feel content, feel satisfied. It's actually a great feeling. Whatever happens today, life is so volatile, as we've known during the COVID times. So it's fantastic to hear that, and it's actually a great advert for many of us, and especially the Gen Zs. We have a lot of young people who watch this show as well, who are considering different professions, the military being one of them. Some are reticent, unsure, some are gung-ho and driven, and I think it's great to see leaders who demonstrate that they come out of that space and now are authors and are using their intellect and their experience and wisdom to envision a future, and a future that could be good for us, potentially.
Or at least we're trying to.
You're trying to, yes, and that's a good thing. Thank you for that. And I think, that honesty and that authenticity as a leader, which is what you are, is reflected in the book to a large degree. And I want to start with the book, if that's okay. So the title is War Transformed, very powerful. And the sort of subheading is the future of 21st century great power, competition, and conflict. I want to focus on that word conflict for a moment, because you have a lot of experience in that. And there is something that bothers me and a lot of our straight talkers for a long time, which is that it feels like human beings, civilization, in relation to war and conflict, hasn't really changed much, I would argue. If you look back at history, and we are students of history too, thousands and thousands of years ago, God knows how many examples we want to take, it feels like whilst there was some peace, or some moments of peace over the last 30, 40, 50 years or so-ish, the type of war that we see coming our way, it may not be conventional as in on the battlefield, but it's very catastrophic in its own way. I mean, cyber warfare has its own implications that can destroy civilization and societies and economies overnight. I want to remain hopeful. I do want to remain hopeful. But I want to ask you how you feel about this concept of conflict, and what's your view as someone who's been at the center of it and now looking 50,000 feet out? What's your belief in humankind and conflict? Where's it going to end up in your view?
I'm an optimist. I actually hope our nature doesn't change, because the reality is we, like every animal on this planet, are competitive entities. Yeah. And competition actually has far more positive outcomes than negative. I mean, every now and then you get some mainly authoritarian person who decides that war is the way they want to resolve some kind of competitive urge that they personally or their regime feels. But the competitive nature of humans largely has led to most progress, whether it's competition in the arts, which has given us great music and paintings and films, whether it's competition in sport, whether it's competition in technology, whether it's competition in different forms of democratic systems. Humans' competitive nature is largely positive, has seen us progress in many aspects of governance. We're not perfect. We may have perfect aspirations about humanity, but we're not quite there yet. So I think competition is largely a good thing, and I don't want that to change. It's just that we need to ensure that in that competitive urge, we have the mechanisms to minimise the chance for war. And when there is warfare, we ensure that those systems that value individuals, value liberty and freedom of expression, freedom of religion, are the ones that win those competitive things that we call wars.
Right. Yeah. And the journey that we've been on with war, of course, and I just want to step back and look at the foundings of the book. So when you started writing this book, because I believe you wrote a bunch of, you were researching and writing a bunch of things, and then you decided to construct it as a book and so on. The thing about books is, I find it interesting, you dedicate yourself for a period of time and you get immersed in the subject. And then when you've written it, you think, I want to put some other stuff in there as well. And now it's published. And then you think about your next book. And then you think, well, actually, I need to... And so I'm sure you're going down that path soon. When you started to write this, and now you've finished it, and you've been on the interview circuit and so on, it's a slightly different question. Not about the findings of your book, which we'll come to, but I'll jump ahead. With the conversations you're having, like here today and various other people, what bits do you think you would want to add to this book if you just had a few more months to go back and make some edits and then republish again with what you've just picked up in the world? Because things are changing at nanosecond rate.
I wouldn't change a lot, because the war in Ukraine was entirely unsurprising to me. I mean, one part of the book, I really took issue with the decline of war, decline of violence crowd. I think they're trying to make a living by telling us that, humans are getting less competitive and are less likely to go to war. I just don't see the evidence for that. So I wouldn't actually change a lot at the moment. But if there was one thing I would really probably double down on, is the power of good leadership. I think we've seen that over the last 5 months, where good leadership from President of Ukraine has saved his nation. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But bad leadership has led Russia into this catastrophe for the Ukrainian people, but also down the line for Russia as well. I mean, this isn't going to end well for Russia, regardless of what happens in the war. So, the centrality of good leadership and the tribulations of bad leadership is probably something I'd look at even in more depth.
Yeah, and that's interesting. We'll touch on that for a second. So when you talk about leadership, because that's fundamental to decision making, in war or outside of war, leading up to war, after war, right? Excuse me. So with with Ukraine and Russia, we'll touch on it just for a few moments. Tell us a little bit about how you see this when you talk about bad leadership or good leadership. And I have to say, I mean, Zelensky, we all know his past, and we know how it's almost accidental. He's almost an accidental leader. And there is something that is very important that I know you talk a lot about, very important in 21st century warfare, which is technology, especially social media. And I think it would have been a massive surprise, unplanned or unprecedented for the Russians to feel or realize that social media, and we've seen this many times before in the spring, the Arab Spring and so on, has actually enabled an individual to become a leader of many people, of just not his nation, of actually many nations. Just recently, Zelensky got the Churchill Award, I think yesterday or the day before, or so on. And so, tell us a bit about what are the traits of good leadership as you see it? Because the corporate would describe it maybe similar, but a little bit different. But what is good leadership in the world of military? Just define it for us.
There is only one form of good leadership, and it doesn't matter what world you live in. Good corporate leadership is exactly the same as good military leadership, which is the same as good community leadership, which is the same as good government leadership. There is no difference. There's just leadership. So I'd make that point. But there's a couple of things that I believe define good leaders. The first one is they're confident in their own abilities and in their own skin and in being themselves without being so arrogant they can't ask for advice or receive advice or act on advice. So that there's that confidence versus humility that's well balanced. The second thing is good leaders provide a plan for their people, for those they lead. They provide direction or vision. Another thing, and I think this is the most important thing that leaders provide, is purpose. They provide the why things are done. Leaders can task people, they can provide direction, but that doesn't inspire people. That doesn't enable innovation. It doesn't enable individual kind of thought. But when you provide purpose, you enable people to think about achieving things differently in order to achieve that purpose, and you inspire them in the darkest hours. Churchill did that, and Zelensky is doing that now. He has inspired his people in their darkest hour for many decades, and he has inspired many people and many government leaders overseas with purpose. So I think, they're the core elements of good leadership. And there's lots of other elements you could add in there about being an example and being a good manager and these kind of things. But I think they're the core aspects that are really, really important.
And I guess when you are a good leader and you're demonstrating some of these traits and behaviors, you also need a structure around you, a set of people around you who can complement your leadership style, because it's not a solo act. How have you seen that playing out? I mean, some examples in your book or in your personal life as a leader. Where has that worked well, and where does it fall apart, no matter how great you are as a leader?
Well, you've got to have a constant interaction with those you lead.
Yeah.
There's lots of different ways you can do that. I mean, you can do it through meetings, you can do it just through walking around, you can do it virtually through social media. So you need to have an interaction with people to appreciate the journey that you're taking people on, to see how they're living it, seeing how they're reacting, seeing how they might provide new and different forms of advice to you, so you can evolve both your direction as well as your leadership style. So, I think that's really important. But the structure is vital. You need to provide priorities. You need to ensure that you have the right people around you, some of whom should be selected because you disagree with them. You need that person whispering in your ear, "Caesar, thou art mortal," as hard as that is. And I tell you, it is hard sometimes when you're trying to get things done. So, these are the important structural pieces that you need as a leader. And you need to be constantly assessing. If you've asked or directed something to be done, you don't just move on. You need to make sure it's being done. Trust but verify, I think, was Ronald Reagan's mantra, but it's a very important one as a leader.
And on the flip side, so bad leadership, I guess it's the opposite of all of those things to some extent. But give us some examples of the situation now. When you talk about Russia, you gave the example of Russia. So what is bad leadership there? What is he doing or they doing that makes you feel like, well, that's totally suboptimal?
Well, I think bad leadership, firstly, is making some bad assumptions upon which you make very large decisions. I mean, the assumptions of Putin leading into this war were, firstly, Ukraine wasn't a real country. Secondly, they probably wouldn't defend themselves. Third, that the West would not stand up and support them. Now, you could make one or two of those assumptions and maybe scrape your way through, but all of them are wrong. So, good leaders test their assumptions before they make the big decisions. If I was to look further down, his military leadership has not been very inspiring so far in this war. Most of the soldiers went into it without actually knowing they were going to war. I mean, that's just terrible. It's unethical. I can't imagine that happening in a democratic system.
And whilst we're talking about Russia, let's talk a little bit about one of the other nations that you've talked about in the book repeatedly, China. And, back at Straight Talk, we discuss and we debate this concept of the three spheres a lot: East, West, and digital. I think almost like a sandwich as well, actually, East, digital, West, and so on, where we believe that there's going to be seismic change in the world order because of digital and other factors too. And there will be an East, and East is subdefined in many ways, and there will be a West, and West the West may or may not comply with one another. The Allies may not agree on basic things like, it sounds absolutely facetious, but cryptocurrency regulation. So there will be disagreements in many ways, and there will be these microcosms that get built. So it'll be a very different West, I think, and that's what we're hearing from a lot of our past speakers and authors and so on, and I'm interested in your opinion. Tell us about your view on China. Again, this is Straight Talk, so you can speak candidly. What's really going on there? And Xi Jinping, for some people, and I've heard you talk about this, for some people there's a view that China is dominant in every way, shape and form. We know economically they've played certain cards. But strategy is something you like to talk about as a leader. Walk us through how strategy is done well and not done so well, and clear some of the myths for us, at least your opinion on whether China is actually executing strategy extremely well, or actually you think it's something else.
Yeah, no, I think China is a great example of bluffing a lot of people that they're good strategists and they always have a long-term view. And I think the last few years under President Xi has been an example of neither. They've been very short-term in their outlook. There is a clear impatience in Xi to achieve a lot of things in his lifetime that has not been characteristic of some of his predecessors. And I think that's led him to make some really profound mistakes in coercive activities against countries that were kind of wavering about their views of China. So I think the myth of they're always long-term thinkers has been busted in many respects over the last couple of years. But I also think their strategic approach over the last few years, where they have sought to coerce countries, where they bullied others, and where they've made themselves a target, whereas previous leaders may not have, hasn't actually been a terribly strategic approach. Their wolf warrior arrogance has backfired against China in ways they probably didn't anticipate, which means they didn't think it through, which means it wasn't terribly strategic. So, I think at the moment, China is a big country. It is a long-standing and great civilization but it's suffering through a period of leadership that isn't very inspired, and I think is very short-term in approach in how it's seeking to achieve strategic outcomes, or what it thinks are strategic outcomes for the CCP in particular, and the preservation of the power of the CCP, but also, I guess, there's some thought in there for the Chinese people, but it's not obvious that that's always the case.
It's interesting you say that. It's a contrarian view, and it's a good view. How does that translate to something that most people are concerned about, which is Taiwan at this point? Of course, the world economy is volatile. We all believe that some sort of a major recession or threat is coming our way, which impacts all societies in Western and actually emerging countries too, to a large degree. I think they'll see a much higher net impact of inflation than even the West. What's your view on Taiwan and China's interest in Taiwan? I mean, there's loads of speculation, but as a leader, former leader in the military, is this going to happen, or is this just sort of, again, hearsay?
Well, I'd say it's certainly not hearsay. President Xi has been very explicit in his speeches, particularly if they're read in Chinese, about the future of Taiwan. It belongs to China. Right. There is no room for misinterpretation of what he's been saying. There is no grey here. It is extraordinarily black and white. Now, the problem we have with how he has been behaving in the last few years is it means hubris and miscalculation are part of how we need to ponder the future of Taiwan over the coming years. Wars don't always start through calculations. They often start through miscalculations. So we shouldn't think there's some kind of straight line thinking that will result in a war or not a war. Often it's a discontinuity or an unexpected event which snowballs into something that neither side expects. So Taiwan may come out of an entirely unexpected event, and it might happen much sooner than people anticipate. I mean, the lessons that President Xi, the Central Military Commission and the CCP are learning from Ukraine may be very different to what we think is learning. I mean, we can't project our historical and ethnic biases on, a civilization like China or other great civilizations. So they may learn that actually doing this quicker than we anticipate at a time when they perceive the West as weak in other areas may become the reality, or they may decide to wait longer. I mean, you can't predict these things, but my sense is this is probably something that's going to happen sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I mean, the implications are huge for all economies and for civic peace, and just for us to continue our lives the way we need to. I mean, the stock market for one could have the worst collapse we've ever seen, given that the semiconductor industry is so dependent on Taiwan, and there's so many other factors that come through it. So that's a little bit about China. Let's talk a little bit about the future of war then. So you've got these various countries doing what they are. The world order seems to be changing because of a variety of megatrends and forces out of our control, as you call them, the discontinuities, that now we can connect the dots and say, well, that was a discontinuity, or that was an unexpected, unprecedented event, or a black swan, or whatever the term may be. Then now we are coming back to the core of your book, really. So when you say war has transformed or is transforming, both, define that for us, and what are the big highlights there? What should we process? Because I know people want to read the book as well, but what should we take away from this?
Well, there's two elements there. There's lots of discontinuities. There's things that are changing. So new technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence, sensor networks, hypersonic, space-based things are changing how we can do things. But there's also a lot of continuities. What we do has remained the same, fight. Good leadership remains essential. How we fight, there's a lot of continuities, as in we try to achieve surprise against each other. So whilst war is transforming, and there's a lot of books out there that cover just the things that are new, we shouldn't forget that there are a lot of things that are remaining the same. And the most important thing that is remaining the same is the enduring nature of war, which is that humans are seeking to impose their will upon one another, and that war, whilst it's fought by militaries, and there's lots of dimensions, is ultimately political, rather than many of the other things that people might say it is.
Do you see war as, because right now it's happening on the ground in Ukraine because it's real, but when you think about virtual war and as AI gets stronger and stronger and more pervasive, to what extent do you see that balance changing where cyber warfare, destabilizing countries at the core and then maybe then attacking them, one of the strategies of war? How do you see that playing out, unraveling over the coming years?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of interesting points that we might note here. Firstly, this notion of virtual warfare is absolutely nothing new. I mean, violence and influence have always been the two parts of warfare. Whether it's violence to influence someone or to influence someone without violence, I mean, they've been two parts of warfare forever. So, cyber in many respects is a continuation of a long tradition of warfare in trying to attack the mind of an adversary just through different ways, whether it's shutting down systems or spoofing them or deceiving them about different things. But it's a new means for achieving an old objective, which is get into the head of an enemy commander and make them think something that you want them to think. So, I think that's cyber and influence operations are a continuity. The interesting thing, however, though, in influence operations with big data, with some really clever analytics, with some bespoke algorithms, we can now detect and target populations, subpopulations with a level of precision that's never been possible before, and at scale in a way that's never been possible. And then we can measure the impact better than we ever have before. It's not perfect in any form, but all those kind of things are new ways of generating influence against individuals and whole populations in a way that's quite unprecedented in human history.
That's interesting. So it's violence, influence, part of the core tenets of how war happens, and then this almost is a bit of an enabler and accelerator to some extent because of its form factor. What do you think about, there's one thing playing on my mind, just because we're talking about AI. So this concept of, and you talked about politics, this concept of disinformation, I mean, it's been used in so many battles and combats, and historically we see this manifested in 21st century, 19th century and beyond warfare, which talks to violence and influence. When you think of deepfakes, so this AI field of computer vision, which is you and I, this is real, so this is definitely real. So a detector could come and try this out, and we're definitely real. You can unpick the frames, and we haven't made this stuff up. Your voice is yours, mine is mine, and so on and so forth. But the future holds some very scary things for us, where deepfake technology is rising at a rapid rate. The deepfake detectors aren't as advanced as the deepfake creators are at this point. Always goes sort of that way. It's like the hacking system. So it's sort of worrying to know that a discontinuity or an unplanned event, or maybe a planned event of a series of deepfakes that go into the political frame, let's say it's before an election or forcing an election or something along those lines, which could create a conflict between one nation and another nation. That's a real form of warfare. What's your view on that in terms of it being one of the tools that countries or nations will use? I mean, it could be used in the West. It could be, I mean, I'm in London, you live in Brisbane. It could be used as a standard means of destabilizing and, creating havoc or sort of chaos in an economy at a social, civic level as well. So, have you got an opinion on that? And there's so many others. I mean, hypersonic, you talk about many other factors, but deepfake really gets me going because I study that in a lot of detail.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not as concerned by it. I don't think it's a strategic tool. You don't need deepfakes to have videos of politicians that say things that sow deep discord. I mean, there's enough real stuff out there doing that. The deepfakes really aren't required to foster the kind of divisions in society that you can then use social media and bots for and against. And we've seen that, we've seen that in election campaigns, particularly in the US, but beyond that. And frankly, if deepfakes, there was an incident where a deepfake did have a significant effect like that, you're going to see counter technologies. I mean, that's just human nature, right? We always come up with counters to things that hurt us. And I would propose that, autonomous systems, we're seeing something the same at the moment. Investment in autonomous systems and lethal autonomous systems in the last 20 years has outstripped the development of counter-autonomy systems until now. And I think Ukraine has been a demonstration that military institutions will need to double down their investment in counter-autonomy systems. And I think, deepfakes will be the same. If there's a significant use that has a bad impact, countries will double down their investment in the technologies to counter deepfakes. There's always a counter. We may not know what it is at the moment, but there's always one. Humans are endlessly creative and imaginative in these kind of things.
Okay, good to know. You talk about Friedman's view, delusional strategy. You've talked about that a lot. Tell us what that means and in what context.
So this was Sir Lawrence Friedman, a magnificent academic and strategist from the United Kingdom, who wrote an article where he called Putin's strategy for Ukraine delusional because of the kind of assumptions that I've already described. And I think it was a really apt description because Putin was deceiving himself about reality. If you read Dixon's book on the psychology of military incompetence, he talks about, this whole deceiving oneself through one's biases, not getting evidence and all these kind of things. So, I think Sir Lawrence's use of the term was entirely apt. I think there was and is sufficient evidence to back it up because it's very hard to see Russia winning this war. I mean, even if they were to successfully take over Ukraine, which I don't think is going to happen, but even if they did, where's the victory in that? I mean, they would be an international pariah. They'd have 44 million Ukrainians who despise them. So there's no pathway to victory for Russia out of this. So in that regard, I think Sir Lawrence Friedman's term is entirely true.
Yeah, beautiful. And when you think about strategies again, and I want to move you to the West now, and whichever part of the West you'd like to pick. Let's start with this the United States, just because
it's a pretty loose definition. There's probably one definition for every person who uses it.
Yeah, I know it's very subjective. Let's go to the United States for a moment, for all the good reasons, because you talk about mosaic warfare and the notion. You call it a notion where there's a simultaneous use of cyber influence military force to overwhelm or confuse, your enemy, and it's about speed. It's about complexity and so on and so forth. So the United States has an interesting strategic position now globally, especially in regard to Ukraine, but also now with China. And I guess you have colleagues that you engage with. Again, this part of your previous remit. Where is the United States in all of this now with the complexities globally? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's in a tough spot. It's probably it's had the most powerful military that's ever existed in human history. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And it probably still is in that position, although China's trying to eat away at that, but I don't think it's there. It's constructed an economy that is a modern wonder, at least until recently, in in generating prosperity for a large proportion, not all, but a large proportion of its population. But there's no society that's made the entirety of its population prosperous in history, so we need to give them a little bit of a break there. But it's now coming up against a strategic competitor who not only is investing a lot in technologies to challenge American technological dominance, is not only generating wealth to challenge American economic power, but is proposing a different architecture for how the world works. One where individual expression and value is subverted into a collective, where the collective direction is not determined by members of it other than a very small, unelected, self-appointed group of old men generally. And all those challenges, the economic, the technological and the ideological, are very difficult to challenge, particularly when your own internal systems are having some ageing problems, let's put it that way. It doesn't mean the Americans can't reform themselves. I do think they will, actually. I've got a lot of confidence in the American system for re-energisation and reinvigoration. But they're just at a point in their cycle where the internal problems make dealing with some of their external problems just that little more challenging. I'm an optimist with America. You never write the Americans off. They've been endlessly inventive about their own systems and how they do things. But China is probably the toughest competitor that they've ever come up against.
And when you think about one of the other issues, which is climate, and it's an interesting one because on the one hand, we've talked a lot about climate on this show, climate realism, as we call it. So we leave all the noise out. But with climate, there's been a massive focus for many generations. It's quite important because the next few generations, we call them the Gen Zs or the Gen Alphas or even the Millennials to some extent, they have this very clear view and a sense of purpose, actually, towards making their world better in whatever way, shape or form. Not that the older generations didn't, but we just had a different mandate at that point, different way of living, a different architecture, as you call it. So many people were hopeful around climate until recently, and then this COP26 happened. Some people are like, well, we're never going to be able to control this because of all of these factors, and now the war's happened with Ukraine. There's an energy crisis in Europe in particular, as you know. Germany is massively exposed, and so are the other countries, the UK included. We've gone down the Brexit path, so who knows where we're going to end up. So the energy crisis is going on. There could be a high likelihood that people, especially emerging countries, gas will become really expensive. The price of oil is going to go up to 150, 170 a barrel plus, and we'll start to, just from points of scarcity and desperation and need, start to use coal again. So that throws all of those CO2 ambitions and net zero ambitions in the dustbin, really. We've never really talked about the implication of war, the use of weaponry. And actually, I don't know the answer, but I'm asking you maybe a very simple question for our audience. How does war and the use of weapons, which are made up of different molecules and chemicals and so on and so forth, how does that impact climate change? It might be a really stupid question, but let's get it clear.
No, I mean, I don't think people shooting each other are really going to do much to raise the temperature of the atmosphere. There's a whole lot of other contributors. I think coal methane is probably going to contribute more. But, I think the relationship between climate change and military institutions and operations is a really important one. And I think there are a whole range of interactions and outcomes that we might hypothesize. As governments are forced to deal with climate change mitigation and response measures, that's going to put pressure on their budgets, and that's going to put pressure on military budgets. I also think the kinds of things that military institutions do in the future will be shaped by responding to climate change events, particularly, if the atmosphere is warming and the oceans are warming. That's just physics, right? There's more energy in the system, so you're starting to get more powerful hurricanes on the east coast of the United States, more powerful cyclones and typhoons in Australia and East Asia, and throughout Asia, actually. So you're going to have more military response systems or other mechanisms that will take away from military resources. So, I think there's more of a conversation about the impacts of climate change on military institutions in the coming years. I get sick of these people who are still trying to fight is climate change happening. It's like, there has never been a single thing that there's been more evidence for in human history, I think. It's time to, really make the hard decisions about mitigation, about slowing and hopefully reversing this process at some point in our near future, because if we don't, this is an existential threat to human beings on this planet. And, if you're not willing to stand up and fight for the existence of human beings, what's the point of this whole thing of us 8 billion humans on the planet?
Yeah, I'm with you. That's a fair point. I want to move to recruitment for a second. I'm intrigued. So over the years, different countries have had, some people have certain rules on conscription and, it's mandatory. Israel is a good example. And interestingly, because we study the startup economy, there's so much innovation happening because of defense in the startup world, and then all these big unicorns and decacorns are built, and this prosperity indirectly back into the economies. It's interesting, the effects of military-based grounding and how innovation is catalyzed on the back of that. What's the face and what's the shape of general recruitment and interest in joining the military? You could you could give me a broad view, like in the East, this is going on, or in India, this is going on, in China, this is going on, in Australia, this is going on, in the UK, this is going on. What are people still wanting to join the military, especially the younger generation? Because of course we're clear about their views. Is that a problem? Or is it not a problem because robots and cyborgs they're going to fight the war, or widgets and bots are going to fight the war in the next 25 years? So what's going on there?
No, well, military institutions are still recruiting people. We're still getting people through the door, and it goes through cycles like everything. When economies are strong, the competition for people is stronger. When economies are weaker, the competition's not as strong. It's a cyclical thing. But, there are some out there who will say, the millennials aren't as interested in military service, or they're this or they're that. Well, I have to respectfully disagree and say that's total bunkum. I have spent years dealing with 18 to 25-year-olds, 35 of them actually, and I haven't seen a lot of difference over that time in the motivations of why people serve, in a whole range of areas of capability. Are people fitter now? Probably not as fit as they used to be, but that's fine. It's about motivations, and character is really what you try and get through the door. And you can get anyone fit if they've got the right character. You can train them to do what they need if they've got the right character. And my view is the millennial generation, like all those before them, have got the same character. They have the same ethos of service. They just have different aspirations, and they have different things that distract them from the world around them than, say, my generation did. It's not better, it's not worse. And I've been extraordinarily impressed by the millennial generation that will assume the mantle of leadership in our army, because they're really, really good. Really good.
That's good to hear, because we hear the same thing in corporate jobs, right, where the caliber, the speed of thought, the decision-making ability is just the broad nature and exposure that generation has is different. Do you think, when you talk about just if you could touch on this sort of, when you talk about the West, joining forces, really, for the want of another term, and working together to combat some of the threats from certain nations who don't have the same ideals or values, how does that actually? Aren't we doing that anyway? How is that different from what we're doing today with all of the institutions that are out there, the UN and various others? Or are you talking about a whole different paradigm? You're saying, nope, that stuff doesn't work for tomorrow. The future.
No, the way the world works is kind of like warfare. You never get rid of an idea; they're always there. It's just you put new ideas on top of the others. I think the system of governance that was set up in the wake of the Second World War was a system that was set up by the victors, which included Russia and China. They are part of the current global governance and multilateral organisations around the world, equal partners in the things like the UN Security Council, and they have both benefited, particularly China, since its ascension to the World Trade Organization in the 90s, benefited enormously by this international governance regime and the system of multilateral institutions and relationships. So when the Chinese and the Russians talk about how they're disadvantaged, it's hard to see the disadvantage in these countries where, they've been made enormously wealthy, although that wealth is probably more concentrated in Russia than it is in China, by the current system. There's other reasons they don't like the system, and it's not because they're not full partners in it.
Interesting. And do you think the world that you might see in the next decade or so or beyond, why don't you describe the world that you think you're going to see in the next 10 years? What's your projection?
Well, predictions, as you know, are extraordinarily perilous. It's like predicting the next horse race or predicting the outcome in a warfare. Anytime there is huge human agency involved, it's by definition unpredictable. But some of the trends I think over the coming years that are going to be important. I mean, you're seeing economically a change in the environment. You're seeing the development of different blocks, I think. The deglobalization that was kind of in evidence before COVID, I think, is accelerating. I think there's potential for technology blocks to form. I'm not convinced it'll happen, but there's potential there for it. I think you're starting to see, Freedom House does its surveys every year. They are not positive trends at the moment. That has potential to continue just because China in particular has made it attractive to countries to buy some of their technologies and approaches that do not encourage democracy. So, they're the kind of negative trends. But on the flip side of that, as we've seen in Ukraine, democracies are pretty resilient, and when they're threatened, they actually can really achieve some amazing things to defend themselves and other democracies. And if you have a look at the EU and the United States alone, you're talking about the first and third wealthiest systems on the globe. They are enormously wealthy, even though, people might say, well, they had big social systems. That's irrelevant. You can always, you look at your systems and how you're spending things when you have that much wealth. So, I think we shouldn't underrate the regenerative power of democracies that are still kind of struggling with how to deal with the most informed electorates that they've ever had. Politicians, I think, are still struggling with having very well-informed electors compared to, say, 30 or 40 years ago. Political systems are still evolving. I'm optimistic that our governance and political systems will reinvigorate themselves, redemonstrate their value to their citizens, because, confidence in democratic systems and institutions of governance is an issue at the moment in many nations, yours and mine included, but America probably the most profoundly. So I'm an optimist that, we can work our way through these systems and these challenges. But I do think that, there is a challenge to democratic governance from China and Russia. They have a narrative of the decline of the West, even though I'm not sure the evidence is there for that. and they feel, particularly, in Xi and Putin, some form of manifest destiny about establishing some alternative to the current way things work in the world.
I'm with you. That's great. I mean, there's some positive things in there, and there's some things that we have to reconsider and just think about quite carefully. Final question, and we've got to close off. We can talk for hours.
Yes, we could.
Yeah, the implication of your book, then. I mean, who do you write it for, by the way? Who do you write this book for?
For me, the first audience is the next generation of military leaders.
Right.
That's who I always kind of think about. I write it for myself because I just enjoy writing. It's a nice way to relax, and it's a nice way to, learn more about the world. But, I wrote it hopefully in a way that is, you can never remove all jargon from these kind of things, whether it's a medical or a military book, but in a way that I hope is accessible to our citizens who need to understand that, wars are just part of human existence, that we need a military as part of a productive democratic system to defend sovereignty and defend our values. And that part of that bargain is that we'll be responsible with the people they give us, the resources that we're allocated, and how we use violence. And that's probably the thing that distinguishes between the militaries of democratic systems and the militaries of authoritarian regimes is we have a profound belief that we must be responsible and ethical users of violence against any human being, whether they're the enemy or whether they're not. And that's what I think is a really important delineation between the militaries of, say, America or Britain or Australia and those of, say, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea.
Got it. That's a great way of closing off our Straight Talk today. It's been, deeply insightful for me to have this discussion with you and get your viewpoints, because this is not theory. You've been on the ground for 35 years. You've got the stars and scars. I use that term a lot. I use that term a lot. It actually makes a lot of sense now, because it's real. And are you going to write another book? Are you planning to write another book now that you're in flow?
Yes. So my next book has already went to the publisher 2 weeks ago. The manuscript for it. This one is fiction. It is about a very near future war over Taiwan, and it's written from the perspective of a historian about 10 years after the war, looking back at it. And it has various characters who command human machine teams or space capabilities and things like that. So I've taken the fiction route because I think narratives are a good way to engage a wider audience for people to learn and think about issues.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. So exciting, because we love fiction. We love, I think, science fiction in particular. I always say...
Yeah, mate, I'm a science fiction nut. I love it.
Yeah. Because actually, I mean, for leaders, when we talk about all these new technologies, my message on LinkedIn the other day was, just cut the crap. Just go read some science fiction. You will expand your mind at a level that's unprecedented. And if you want to imagine, well, what would we do with an NFT? Well, forget reading the paper and the thesis from the academic institution, as much as I respect them. Go read science fiction and
read a story.
Read a story. So happy you're doing that. Have you got a name for the book yet?
At this point, it will be called White Sun War. But we'll see what the publishers think. But no, I've written science fiction. I've even written an illustrated science fiction story and run electives using science fiction, because I think it is a really powerful way to nurture creativity and expand people's view of the world.
Absolutely. That's so exciting. We'd love to get you back on the show when you release that book. And just describe
It'd be my pleasure.
Yeah, describe the narrative for us. So
it'll be the first half of next year.
Okay, we'll bear that in mind. Mick, it's been a real pleasure having you on Straight Talk. Thank you for your candid style and being direct and helping us truly understand where we are today and where we might end up. And I've really enjoyed the show. Before we close off, is there anything you'd like to say in terms of the experience today? How do you feel? what was your takeaway? Because it's so important that you're engaged and you feel different about this as well.
Oh no, I love these kind of conversations. I love this format because you kind of push me in intellectual directions that are really important. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk today, not about my book, but just talk about humans and how they interact.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. And we'll get you back on the show. Thanks again. Where can people find you? I know the book, we'll promote the book, of course, but just tell us, if someone wants to reach out to you because they have a view or an opinion, you're open to that, and where can we get hold of you?
They can go through my website, mickryan.com.au, or my Twitter handle is War in the Future. So they're two ways that you can follow what I'm doing, and through those I tweet the articles, the numerous articles that I put out a couple a week at this point in time.
Thank you so much, and be well, take care of yourself. Thank you for contributing this excellent piece of discourse and almost literature as well for us to consume. And we'll be in touch. Thank you very much, Mick.
No worries, Af. It was great to talk to you, mate.
Yeah, you too. Take care. Be well.
Bye.
Adios.